Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the Cram Podcast. Now, today's topic, it's not for the faint-hearted, the end of civilization. Now, that sounds dire and pretty depressing, right? Except I did add a question mark at the end of it because I'm hoping our guest will give us a shred of hope for the future. It's a topic that I believe more and more people are actually thinking about. And even if it's not front of mind, I think somewhere in your subconscious, there is a fear. Maybe it's climate change, war, economic and racial disparities, political extremism. We wonder whether the world is on a path of self-destruction. A researcher who's been studying this question is Luke Kemp. Normally, our podcast features the work of Canadian researchers, but Luke's work and ideas were so compelling, we wanted to have him on to share his views. He's a research affiliate with the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, also known as CSER, at Cambridge University in the UK. But this year, he's a faculty fellow with the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies in the US, which is where we have reached him. Luke, we're very happy to have you on as our special guest on the podcast.
And I'm very happy to be here, Mary. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So I have to say, I chuckled because when I went to the CSER website, they had in brackets, I guess it's your nickname, Dr. Doom. Like, is that a name that actually wins you friends and admirers?
I would hope so. Either way, it's what I'm stuck with, unfortunately. It's my favorite comic book character as a kid. And my brother, once he realized that I was joining the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, he decided to actually make me this mask.
Oh.
And apparently, if you wear that and you research claps, that leads to a nickname pretty quickly.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay. All joking aside, let's get to some serious stuff here. First of all, in my intro, I was saying that we have this fear of the world self-destructing. And, you've obviously looked at the demise of past civilizations. I'm wondering whether have they been responsible by and large for their own demise, or were there external factors that they couldn't control?
It is usually a combination of both. One quick example here. There was a Mayan city-state called Caracol, which experienced different periods of drought. During one of those periods, early in its existence, it actually reached its highest level of population and territorial growth. So it basically reached its peak during a drought. A couple of hundred years later, it faces a similar drought, and this drought coincides with its collapse. Now, drought is often put forward as a key reason as to why the Maya collapsed, but given that some city-states seem to go through droughts previously with very few problems, and then suddenly they collapse later on, to me suggests that something's changed internally at society. And this happens across a lot of different cases, not just the Maya, also the Puebloan peoples, for instance, in the southwest United States. What I think is happening is you do have external shocks. Things like disease, climate change, invasions, they do matter. But what often matters more is the internal fragility of the society. And what we see happening quite frequently is societies growing more fragile over time. So we even actually have...
Right. Okay, wait a minute. Society's growing more fragile over time. Is that normal for that to happen?
It seems like it could be. So recently, myself and a number of colleagues, both archaeologists, historians, and complexity scientists, we put forward an article into the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And in it, we composed a large-scale database of all the states that existed throughout the pre-modern period. So all the way before 1800 to, I think, 2500 BCE. And we tried to look at when do they start and when do they finish? When do they terminate? And in general, is there an increase in the longevity over time or not? So the key thing here is if a society is growing more fragile, then what you expect is basically there should be more deaths occurring over time. If it's not growing more fragile, then you expect basically the deaths to be more or less dispersed. So you're as likely to die at year 100 as year 1000 as year 1. What we found was that the risk of termination rises over the first 200 years. And then it basically reaches a high point and plateaus, which is pretty similar to what happens to human mortality as well. So we basically become more fragile with age, and then eventually we reach a kind of age around about 70 or so, where we kind of, a peak fragility. And then from there, our risk of death is pretty much constant.
So then if it is common and perhaps even, quote unquote, normal for a civilization to become fragile over time, then is it normal then for civilizations to go extinct?
To terminate or collapse? Yes, I believe so. I think we tend to view these as great historical tragedies, that if a state or a culture either transforms or collapses, it's a bad thing. Not necessarily. And bear in mind, many of these states we're talking about throughout history were fairly brutal and oppressive. And Rome, towards its end, had reached 3/4 towards the way of the maximum level of theoretical inequality. So that maximum level is basically one person taking all the additional surplus wealth, and no one gets anything above their basic subsistence.
So much worse than today, you're saying.
Very close to, yeah. I mean, yes, Rome was even worse than today. And of course, they had far less, which meant people weren't doing that well under the Roman Empire.
So is that one of the factors that marks a civilization's fragility, when you have that kind of disparate wealth and power?
I think that's the key determinant of societal fragility is inequality. We see it over and over again across different case studies, and that inequality seems to both breed societal discontent. It often leads to what some researchers have called mass deprivation. So basically, as wealth gets siphoned and funneled from the masses towards the elites, people have worse and worse living conditions. So look at the deaths of despair right now in the United States, for instance. And additionally, as it becomes more pyramidal and lopsided, you have more people, elites, trying to compete over who controls the society. So inequality drives a whole bunch of really bad things, which basically make society more fragile over time until eventually something like climate change or disease comes through and knocks it over.
Oh, okay. Oh, so interesting. So yeah, you're going back to the idea that there are internal forces at work here that can cause self-destruction, but then an external force can come along, and because the system is already weak, that'll do it in. That possibly could do. Yeah. Okay. So if that is a big one, inequality, what else then have you and other researchers determined as the other contributing factors to the demise of a civilization?
So I think inequality is interesting because it seems to have these knock-on effects. So I've already mentioned a few of them. One is kind of mass deprivation. Another one is elite competition. And again, Dan Hoyer in Canada at the University of Toronto has done a lot of work on that, as well as Peter Turchin. Another one is you seem to get increasing levels of corruption. And essentially what corruption does is it moves money away from the state towards basically the private sector. And again, the state becomes more fragile because of that. It has less resources to address any incoming threats. On top of that, we have really good evidence that when you have decision-making made by fewer people, it results in worse decisions. And what happens with inequality, of course, is that you end up just society becoming more oligarchical. There's basically small groups making decisions about very big collective matters. And that tends to, in general, lead to much worse decisions. On top of that, there seems to be also problems potentially with environment as well, as you'd expect. Although, interestingly, when you look at the case studies, there's very few we can point towards where they're really clear examples of what some people call ecocide, where essentially the society destroys its own environmental base, it overshoots, and then collapses. That happens very rarely. And the two cases I can think of which stand out here both happen in the Middle East in a very fragile environment where they're essentially dependent upon irrigation infrastructure in a very marginal, dry environment. And essentially, the existing government at the time, one of the caliphates, mismanages the ways they're using their irrigation, the infrastructure falls apart as they collapse, and of course, a lot of people die and move away. So environmental pollution can play a role as well. And one that is difficult to wrap your head around, but it's going to become very important going towards the future, is what some people call energy return on energy invested. So if I get a barrel of oil out of the ground, how much oil do I have to use? How much energy do I have to use to get that oil out of the ground? So it's the ratio. And one of the original theories of collapse was that basically over time, as you invest more and more energy into a society, you reach a tipping point where suddenly you're starting to basically reverse the ratio, and you're basically spending more and more energy to get less and less out, either of labor or of the ground, for instance. And once you reach a tipping point, it makes society more fragile. So what we see right now for oil, for instance, most fossil fuels, is they have this plummeting EROI, as we call it, energy ratio, if you will.
So when you say energy return on investment and you give the example of oil, are you speaking literally about energy, or is it energy also meaning just labor, like let's say a country as a whole and the amount of labor, resources, money put into something, and what are we getting in return? I just want to be clear about what you mean.
So the original theory was the latter. So this is the idea of diminishing returns on complexity. And that was the original big theory of an anthropologist called Joseph Tainter, who published a book called The Collapse of Complex Societies back in 1988.
Yes.
And that was considered to be the kind of landmark text of collapse studies. The problem is that Tainter is a bit unclear about what complexity is. And he often seems to be referring to it as energy, and energy in this really broad sense, as you mentioned, of people, the environmental projects you're calling out, etc. To me, that is a bit too fuzzy. It's a bit too difficult to measure, and it confuses a lot of things together. What we have now when we study energy is this idea of energy ratio, or energy return on energy invested, which I've already explained earlier. And what we do see is when you measure it, it seems to be decreasing over time. So when you tapped into an early oil well in Texas, say during the 1920s or 1910s, just take a little bump in the ground and you'd see this huge geyser of oil shoot up tens of meters into the air. We don't get that anymore. We have to dig deeper and deeper with more sophisticated technology to pull oil out of the ground. And when you actually measure this, it turns out that we previously had an energy ratio of 100 or more in the 1920s. So it would only take one barrel of oil, that much energy, to get 100 out of the ground.
Right.
Guess how much it is today?
I don't know, 1,000?
No, about 20 or 30.
Oh, 20 or 30. Okay.
Yeah, so it's dropped dramatically. And if you measure this slightly differently, you look at the actual, rather than the amount of energy we pull out of the ground, but rather the amount of energy we actually get once it goes to the consumer, it's even lower. It's probably below 10. And that's decreasing every year.
It's decreasing. Okay. You know what? Just going back to that idea of complexity, I find that interesting though, because I mean, as civilizations get older, do they not become usually more complex? In the sense that, right, like when I think about our own society, right, we have so many systems at work, right? Whether it's, businesses, banking, our food industry, and everything is working and interconnected, which adds to complexity, right? And would that in itself be a factor of, like a possible factor of fragility? I don't know. I'm just wondering.
I remain unconvinced. I think there's a few problems here. Okay. One is that it's really hard to know what to measure when we talk about complexity. And in some things are becoming more complex, I grant you that. Some things are actually becoming much more simplified.
Like what?
Languages, for instance. So right now we're undergoing a mass language extinction. by the end of the century, somewhere between 50 to 90% of existing languages are going to be dead.
50 to 90%?
Correct. And if you compare a country like, well, my own of Australia, compared to just overseas Papua New Guinea in the highlands has hundreds of different dialects and languages. In Australia, we basically have more or less one dominant language, English. Likewise, if you think of culture, we're becoming really homogenized. I mean, I can very easily travel to different countries. I know roughly how the legal system will work. I know roughly how the currency is going to work, etc. There's actually a surprising amount of homogeneity. If you were living in the world 3,000, 4,000 years ago, good luck traveling randomly to a different part of the world. You could end up in a hunter-gatherer tribe, a pastoralist empire, or a small agrarian city-state. We were all over the place in terms of social forms. So I think it's really difficult to put forward this idea of complexity. I think maybe if you just focus on one thing, like bureaucracy, there could be a truth there. I think where I struggle still is this idea. So in Tainter's theory, we grow in complexity because we have to address new problems. We face a problem, we add complexity, and eventually you get so much complexity, you collapse underneath the sheer amount of accumulated bureaucracy and complexity. Where I think that goes wrong is there's actually a whole bunch of problems we face where simplification would actually solve them. And we're not exactly doing the most efficient, easy routes to solving societal problems. As one quick example, right now, climate change. Does it really require a huge amount of additional complexity to reduce carbon emissions? Not necessarily. I mean, quite to the contrary, one of the easiest ways to reduce carbon emissions is to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. Right now, globally, we directly subsidize fossil fuels by the tune of billions. If you look at it in terms of indirect subsidies, so how much are the impacts on the healthcare system, for instance, it's been close to $2 to $3 trillion. If you just get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, that both simplifies things and addresses the problem. The reason why we're struggling with climate change and the reason why we have these increasingly more Byzantine regulations and complexity is not because we naturally need to add complexity to the system. It's because of politics. It's because of oligarchy. It's because of the influence of the fossil fuel sector. So I think this idea of viewing societies as kind of like biophysical organisms, just add complexity naturally, it really obscures the fact that these are political choices. This is a political system. This is a system of power.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I don't okay. I think though, can't both be true. Like, I understand what you're saying about solutions possibly being simple, but also, why can't complexity also exist? The fact is that we just don't act with simple solutions, right? We leave the situation as being complex and confusing. And then under that, the weight of that, we become more fragile. Can't that be true as well? Why can't both be true?
I think, so two things here. One would be, it would still stem from inequality, right? So the key thing would be here that we're building complexity because we're not making the right choices, and we're doing so because we basically live in really fragile, unequal societies.
I have to think about that one, but okay, go on.
I think the second problem would still be, to me, the problem still just is still the basic idea of what is complexity? I mean, we kind of have this like rough idea of more bureaucracy, I guess, but that's kind of hard to measure. It seems intuitively right, but at the same time, as mentioned, there's lots of areas which get simplified.
Okay, you know what? Maybe this is what I mean, or maybe this is another factor, like interconnectedness. The fact that we are so reliant now on others to be self-sufficient, that, no one state or whatever can kind of go it on its own. We need someone else to provide us with water, let's say, or energy or whatever it is. And so because of that, does that also make us more vulnerable?
Now you're getting somewhere. So
okay, yay. All right.
With some qualifiers.
Okay.
So what we know from complex system science is that in general, as the system becomes more interconnected, it does become more resilient, more robust to small shocks. So the key thing here being, if you suffer a shock in one area of the system, it can shift resources to basically buttress that. So think of a coral reef. If one part is going down, basically, oh no, actually, here's a better example. Think of the modern world. When we have any kind of state that is about to fall apart, Somalia, Rwanda, etc., what happens?
Well,
we send aid, we send governance.
A bit late, but we
quite frequently, granted sometimes it's in a very exploitative manner, often for a scramble for resources and military intervention. But nonetheless, the goal is always to prop up some kind of existing government. The goal is always we need to have more states, basically. We need to have a new power structure there. The key thing is that you can't let a state or a power structure die in the modern economy. Previously, that wasn't the case. So complex systems, increasing interconnectedness usually means more resilience to small perturbations, to small shocks. If you have enough interconnectedness, what happens is it protects you against small shocks, but it actually amplifies really big ones. Because you have all those interconnections, they can be spread throughout the system. Think of the global financial crisis. You have a housing bubble in the US, and suddenly you have recessions happening all across the world.
Right.
That's the price of interconnectivity.
Right. Or the pandemic.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. Okay. But now what about longevity? How does that factor in? I mean, the Roman Empire was around for a while, but then of course that collapsed. Did longevity have anything to do with that? Or even geographical power? The fact that it was huge. How do those...
So the longest living state in our sample was the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire.
Right.
And depending upon where you measure its cutoff date, it was roughly over 1,000 years, just over. Pretty damn long. It seems to have been a combination of different factors for them. So they did almost completely go under during the 1600s and 1700s due to large-scale losses of territory to the caliphate. So this is basically the emergence of Islam and an empire that followed from that. What kept the Byzantine together were a couple of different factors. One was there was a surprising amount of coherence amongst the elites. Basically, the elites shared a religion, and they were surprisingly dedicated towards the state. The second was better climatic conditions. So it was actually improvement in climatic conditions, which basically improved their crop yields during that time as well. Thirdly, they geographically were in a pretty good spot. So Constantinople was fairly easy to defend. It had huge fortifications, and it made it really difficult to take overall. So John Howden, a historian at the Princeton University, has pointed out a whole bunch of different factors that seem to have led to the surprising resilience of the Byzantine. But let's look beyond the Byzantine, and let's think more broadly about how societies proved resilient. One of the best studies here come from a scholar called Peter Peregrine at Yale University. And he looked at this period, what we often call the late Roman Little Antique Ice Age. So basically, during the end of the Roman Empire, there's a drop in temperatures across most of the world, particularly northern hemisphere. He tried to look at how did different societies respond. He took a set of 24 societies across the northern hemisphere. He measured what was the difference in temperature they experienced. How much cooling did they go through? Because it, of course, varied across different regions. And then he also took a measurement of how much did they change? Did they lose much of the population? Did their leaders and hierarchy potentially fall apart? Did their territory change dramatically? Did their norms and customs change? And what he found was that in general, there was a correlation roughly between the amount of cooling and the amount of social change. But that wasn't the primary determinant. There were lots of different areas and polities which experienced lots of cooling, but changed very little. So he did some follow-up studies, and what he found was the biggest factor which explained why some societies seemed more robust and resilient to climatic change was inclusive institutions. When they were more democratic, when they basically had more inclusive political structures and decision-making, they tended to experience less social change and deal with both hardship and climatic change much more effectively. And this is actually a finding we see in modern disaster risk studies as well. So if you look in the modern world and you try to look at population loss and loss of GDP during natural disasters, so hurricanes, earthquakes, even terrorism, the best studies here all suggest that when you have usually a stronger state plus a more democratic one, that tends to minimize the amount of losses you take. It results in more resilience. And there's a general finding here that if you have more inclusive institutions, people tend to both cope with and prepare better for disasters. So in short, democracy equals greater resilience.
Okay, what about, because, you listed off some of those common factors you noticed in the demise of civilization. So we talked about oligarchy, inequality, climate change could be one, maybe environmental degradation. But if you look at today, what about factors that exist today that didn't exist for previous civilizations? And I think about AI, nuclear threat. What about those?
Yeah, these are what I call technological revenge effects. So we create certain kinds of technologies and they almost have a rebound effect, a revenge effect upon society. A really benign example of this is the invention of email. We originally invented it because it seemed like it would actually reduce communication by quite a lot. And yet when you actually look at time use survey data, we had an increase in the amount of time, a very dramatic one, after the invention of email, because it was so easy suddenly to actually contact someone that we found more and more reasons to do so. Of course, in this case, when we say revenge effect, it's much, much worse. I think there's still a connection here, but so when you think about nuclear weapons or artificial general intelligence or even climate change, why is it, for instance, that we haven't taken action on climate change? And who's responsible for the majority of emissions? So climate change is very concentrated in terms of its production. Right now, at a country level, if you're looking at cumulative emissions, so who's historically responsible overall, the US is responsible for roughly a quarter of global emissions. If you look at the top 10 emitters, they were responsible for roughly 80% of emissions. If you look at this in terms of companies, it's, I think 170 companies are responsible for 79% of industrial emissions, at the very least. And if you look at it in terms of class, I forget the exact figure here, but it's something like the top 10% of wealth earners in the world are responsible for over 50% of global emissions. There's a very clear trend there. It's, again, inequality. And when you look at what we have enacted on climate change, one of the biggest factors has been the fossil fuel industry. There was a wonderful book published by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway on the merchants of doubt, how during the 1970s and 80s, even though fossil fuel companies like Shell and BP knew about climate change, they'd done their own modeling which confirmed it. They employed scientists to intentionally discredit the science of climate change and to slow action as much as possible. And if you look at international negotiations around climate change, it ends up being countries like Saudi Arabia, who are basically petro-oil states, who try to slow negotiations as much as possible, something I've seen firsthand quite a lot. So even there, it's inequality and oligarchy that end up being the driving factors behind why we're facing these big problems. And likewise, I've used climate change, but trust me, it holds for everything else. If you're looking at AI, there's only really big three companies who are doing it right now. Microsoft with OpenAI, Google with DeepMind, and Anthropic. And again, I get the feeling that if you actually ask citizens, should we build technology that might kill us all? They'd probably say no. But the ones who are making money off it are quite happy to go ahead and do so. Nuclear weapons, 89% of the stockpiles held by two countries, the US and Russia. And when you look at how we make decisions about nuclear weapons, they are incredibly secretive and oligarchical. In the US, the decision to launch a nuclear weapon, or to launch all the nuclear weapons, lies in the sole hands of one individual, the president. Yes, they need to have advisors, but the decision ultimately just rests with them. It's a thermonuclear monarchy, not a democracy. So again, even for all these, the key driver is oligarchy and inequality.
Yeah. And also, all those factors that you talk about are ones that we ourselves have generated.
Yep.
That we just to really, to some extent, we can control. They're not, you know what I mean? They're not something that comes out of nowhere, or they're external factors that we can't control. We could.
Precisely.
So, yeah.
I think it's worthwhile quickly pondering on the question of we, because the average Rwandan peasant farmer doesn't have that much control over the nuclear weapon arsenal or the emissions of the US. I actually think, again, that the key thing here ends up being democratization. So are you familiar with the Trinity test?
Yes.
Of course, Oppenheimer, everyone loves it now.
Exactly. The movie, too, that really, made it popular again. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a situation here where by that time we knew, so the United States is building a nuclear bomb. It's going to test it. The physicists say there's a non-zero probability that this could ignite the entire atmosphere of Earth, killing all life. At the same time, we also know that the Nazis are not on the right track to building the bomb. Basically, the original motivation for building it was, let's get it before the Nazis. We now know at this stage that the Nazis aren't going to do it. And there's some evidence that the Nazis even weren't planning on doing it, because there was a quote, I'm not quite sure if it's real or not, but there was one reported quote from Hitler of, "I don't want to rule over a Reich of cinders." So when he found out how destructive this could be, he decided not to build it. Now, imagine if we took a random selection of citizens from the US. We just picked 9 or even 100. We took them together and we said, here's all the evidence we have at the bomb. The fact that there's a non-zero probability it could destroy all life on Earth. The fact that we know the Nazis aren't building one. What conclusion do you think they'd reach? If you sat them like a jury, like we do with criminal court cases, they had to sit there and debate it out. They got briefed by experts. I would be incredibly surprised if they said, use that bomb.
What political background do they have?
Well, this is the thing. We have a lot of different examples here where you actually get people from radically different backgrounds.
Right.
And what tends to happen is they still surprisingly converge on relatively good policy. And by the end, they're actually less polarized because they come to like each other. It's really hard to get humans in a room and not have them like each other by the end.
I think you're right about that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've even done this in France. Great example, the Yellow Jacket Revolution, which is largely about both inequality and rising energy prices. Mm-hmm. So Macron said, okay, look, I hear your grievances. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a climate assembly process where the climate policy of France will be determined by this very large assembly chosen by lottery of normal French citizens. They'll be briefed by experts, and after 2 years, we'll have this big policy package which I will adopt. Any recommendations that they have, I will put directly into legislation. 2 years later, we have this wonderful process, a very comprehensive, progressive climate package. Bear in mind, lots of the people involved would have been right-wingers. Nonetheless, it ended up being a really good piece of policy. The key problem was Macron only adopted, 2 of 148 recommendations, or something along those lines. So once again, even there, the key problem comes down to actually a lack of democracy and inclusive institutions. And I think this is actually the kind of defining narrative across most of human history, is this battle between more extractive, unequal institutions and more inclusive ones. And the latter tend to be resilience building, the former tend to destroy themselves over time.
Okay, so then, given all the factors that we've discussed that could lead to the demise of a civilization, when you look at what's going on today in the world, where do you think we are on that graph of fragility heading towards collapse? Luke, where?
I never like to try to put a date on doomsday.
Don't have to be super specific, but just kind of, we're really close. Well, we're about 3/4 of the way there. We're halfway, give me some sense here.
I think the best we can do here is create a barometer. So understand what are the pressures that are pushing us towards a collapse type scenario and the pressures that are pushing us away. And I do this in one part of my book, which is coming out in May next year.
Okay.
In short, it doesn't look good.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at inequality, then what is it? The top 1% of global wealth holders have more wealth than the bottom 50% of humanity combined. And inequality across at least most OECD countries seems to be increasing. Oligarchy, very difficult to measure, but when we're looking at, say, the presence of dark money and lobbying, it's hard to measure, but it seems to be growing, and that's fueling a lot of the resentment that we have in societies like the US right now.
Mm-hmm.
Climate change, pretty easy. It's getting worse.
Yeah.
There's some evidence that we may have been underestimating how sensitive the climate is. And even if you're looking without that lens of it's potentially worse than we expected, it's still pretty bad. So if you double emissions from pre-industrial levels, which we're heading towards doing, then you can expect a temperature rise of roughly between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius. But the thing here is it's all probabilistic. So there's actually an 18% chance that you end up with temperature rise above 4 degrees. And bear in mind, this temperature rise is geologically unprecedented. Even during the worst mass extinction periods throughout Earth's history, it wasn't happening as quickly as this.
Okay, so things are looking pretty bad.
Yeah. Basically, no matter which of the factors you look at, things seem to be getting worse. The main thing that we have on our side is we have a lot of energy and a lot of technology.
Okay, is that the shred of hope you're giving me? I think I need more than that. Can you give me something more than that? Is there something that we should all be doing? You know what I mean? I think a lot of us just feel like, oh my goodness, what can we do? You talk about the peasant, right? That's the situation that most of us feel we're in, right? We're peasants. What can we do?
Okay, I'll give you one shred of hope, and I'll start with a provocative comment.
Okay.
Populism. Populism is almost always looked upon as a bad thing. First of all, I dislike the term because anything that can incorporate both Bernie Sanders and Trump is a pretty useless terminology. But realistically, both Trump and Sanders are kind of tapping into the same discontent, which is more or less people both on the left and the right saying, we're not really happy with how society is being run. The people who are supposed to be representing us making decisions are not doing so. They're often more interested in both themselves and the private sector than they are in us. And that we should have greater representation of normal people, more inclusive institutions, if you will. I think that would be a pretty wonderful thing. And I think, honestly, I hope the big message that people take away from both the book and my study of collapse is that inclusive institutions are probably the most flexible way of building resilience. And the beautiful thing here is that by having a society that's more democratic, you're not just becoming more resilient, you're also becoming more just as well. And this goes across a whole bunch of different areas, even climate change as well. We forget that 12 million people roughly every year die due to carbon dioxide emissions. So that's directly from things like lung cancer, for instance, not even thinking about the long-term impacts of climate change. You could save those people. You could also have a whole bunch of additional knock-on benefits if you reduce carbon emissions. Again, a more resilient world is also a more just one. So I guess there's kind of actually 2 points of hope there. One is that I think trying to think about collapse and trying to build a more resilient society actually builds a better one, a more just one. And secondly, is that I do think deep down most people have this yearning for having more democratic, inclusive institutions right now. And unfortunately, we're constantly branding it as populism and as a bad thing, etc. And granted, it's bad when these people get misled by a demagogue like Trump. But the underlying motivation here, the distrust they have of existing institutions, I think is actually a good one. And if that can be tempered towards actually encouraging greater direct democracy and deliberative democracy, then I think the world is in a much better place.
You know, it's so interesting that for somebody who studies something like this, you actually seem pretty positive. Like you give off a pretty positive, hopeful air. Am I right? I don't know. Are you a positive person?
I think that's a hard one to answer. I think I'm quite pessimistic about the future. I think I'm quite optimistic about people.
Oh.
And this is the other thing I learned from...
That seems paradoxical, but okay. Because the future is people, but anyway.
No, but it comes down to how you organize people. I think people in general are wonderful. You know, we survived through the Ice Age, and we lasted in times when our ancestors, like the Neanderthals, could not, because we were pro-social and we were really good at cooperating across really large groups. So at the beginning of the book, I actually try to look at how does collapse look across the Ice Age, so for the first 200,000 years of human history. It's very difficult to understand how collapse looks exactly, but the thing that really struck me was it seems like we were pretty resilient and, more importantly, very cooperative. So if you look at North America, we seem to have these cultural zones where everyone has very similar tools and styles. So they'll all actually make arrowheads, for instance, in a similar way. What that suggests is you had very large movements of people between different groups and probably very little conflict. You know, if you're terrified of going outdoors because the group next to you is going to kill you, you're not going to all have the same style of arrowheads. You're not going to be trading and developing very similar tools and cultures. But that's actually what characterized our deep history is pro-sociality, cooperation, and as far as we can tell, a really fierce egalitarianism.
Well, that you just said it there. So it sounds to me, you believe in people. We do have the capability then of making change, of actually, it is within us to turn things around from what you're saying, right? With cooperation, democracy, getting involved, voting, right? All those things.
I think the dark side here is that while I'm very positive about people, when we put people in charge of others, when we give them lots of power, that's where things can go wrong. There's a very big literature and a growing body of evidence on how power corrupts. That when you put people into a position of power over a hierarchy, they tend to develop less sympathy and compassion for those below them, less risk aversity. They also tend to be more likely to cheat, both sexually and otherwise. So you might remember the Ashley Madison scandal. This was an app basically allowing one spouse, I think it was mainly husbands, to cheat on their wives. Guess which area
it was directed to married people, and that you could go on this app and find a partner. Yeah.
Precisely. And guess where this cheating app was used most frequently? Washington, D.C., of course.
Ah. Oh, right. That's right. Because I think they said they were going to come up with there was a list, I think, of people who used it and a lot of,
Yeah.
So
power corrupts.
I don't think that's a new concept, though, Luke. I don't think that's something.
No, it's not. But the thing is,
I think Shakespeare was writing about that too.
I think you're right. I think there's two problems here. One is that there's a difference between like a truism, something we just kind of think is right, versus something which we now have really hard neuroscience and psychological evidence on. And secondly is, even though we know that's right, we don't seem to make our societies based upon that fact.
Yeah.
So I think that's the key picture I have here, is that power corrupts, unfortunately. People are pretty good, and the best we can do to make sure the long-run future goes well is to essentially level our power structures and to share power more widely.
What a fascinating talk. Luke, I'm going to have you back on when your book comes out. Congratulations.
I'd love to be back on.
Yeah, look forward to that. Thanks so much for spending time with us today, Luke.
My absolute pleasure, Mary.
That is Luke Kemp. He's a faculty fellow with Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Studies in the U.S. He is also a research affiliate with the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, also known as CSER, at Cambridge University in the UK. For more information on Luke and his work, please check out our show notes. That is it for today's Cram podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Lots to think about. If you'd like to follow us on social for the latest updates, our handle is @CramIdeas. Thanks for joining us today, and see you back here next time. At least we hope so.